We're here on a Monday morning to discuss the budget, the governor's budget proposal, specifically having to do with education. You know, budgets here in Albany are about setting priorities. And the governor has sent a clear message to everyone in New York State, every teacher, every parent, and most importantly, every child, that their education is not a priority to her. She's cut spending to education by over $400 million. In my district alone, it's $5.2 million. There isn't a single school district in my district that isn't seeing a cut at a time when our children are still recovering from the impacts of COVID, from being outside of schools, and we all understand that there is a significant impact to our children from those 2 years that they'll never get back. And so the idea that somehow we are going to devalue their education by removing funds from our school districts that are critically important to giving them a part of those 2 years back is something that we can't acknowledge. And frankly, it's up to the governor and the majorities in this legislature to speak to why they would allow that to happen. Now, the governor talks about smoothing, and that in this case, there are school districts that have had a loss in funding for children and what we've called hold harmless. But folks, I'll tell you, in my districts, those numbers fluctuate from year to year. The whole idea of hold harmless was to create stability in our school districts and allow school districts the ability to fund year over year. So these choices that are made to defund schools because they've lost a handful of students only to give them more next year when those students return is absurd. We recognize that as a result of hold harmless, we provide stability in education funding, and it's critically important that we continue to do that. Now, you're going to hear from a number of my colleagues today with regard to certain proposals, but it should not be lost on anyone today that the governor's budget proposal prioritizes things other than education. At a time when she's cutting education for our children, she's prioritizing spending $2.4 billion on a self-created migrant crisis. The residents of my district and residents across this state did not vote for New York State to be a sanctuary state. They did not vote for New York City to be a sanctuary city. They didn't vote to have undocumented immigrants come into our country and take over resources that were meant for our communities, and most importantly, in this case, for our children and our schools. And yet here we are. $2.4 billion, $500 million more over last year, and yet we're losing $412 million in our schools cumulatively. Now, there isn't a single school district or Senate district in this state that isn't impacted other than those that are in the Big Five. New York City seeing an increase, Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, and Yonkers as well. And so, again, the governor's prioritizing urban districts over suburban and rural districts, and it has to stop. Now, there are a couple of options that we can talk about. One of those is looking at the per pupil funding that has remained constant since the formula was first developed. It's $500 per student, and it's been $500 per student for at least the last 15 years, if not longer. That needs to be adjusted, and at a time, if you go back and look, that education spending in this state has increased, either doubled or tripled over those 15 years. That $500 per student reimbursement rate remains constant, and that has to change. Two, there are districts that we have throughout this state that receive funding from New York State, some 5.5% of their entire state funding, of their entire school budget funding. We would propose, and we're working on legislation that would create a floor of 20%. There is no school district in this state that should receive less than 20% of their funding for their entire budget in light of state education department mandates and requirements from this state. I have a school district in my district that receives 5%. 95% of school funding comes on the backs of taxpayers, and they're about to lose about $800,000 year over year. So I'll ask you, because they're asking me, at a time when they are losing $800,000 and they only receive 5% of their overall funding from the state, where are they supposed to get that? How are they going to keep teachers employed and keep those children educated? Because we're not cutting fat, folks. We're cutting bone. And the governor knows that. And so I think you're going to hear loud and clear today from my colleagues and certainly from me, enough is enough. We're going to prioritize our children.